Welcome to Things You Don't Know. This episode highlights one of the most popular, although unofficial, celebration days, April's Fool's Day. For this episode, we are planting 3 April Fool's jokes in this presentation that are false, absolutely false. And we will send a personalized keychain to the first 3 subscribers, whether new subscribers or old, who identify the 3 jokes or pranks. We will publish a correction detailing those 3 jokes in this podcast as soon as we have our 3 winners, or by April 15th, the first robin of the spring, if no one has guessed the 3 jokes previous to that. Okay, the origin of the celebration is really kind of not very clear, although there are several different origin stories typically cited. So happy hunting.
One possible origin was the religious festival celebrated over several days in ancient Rome called Hilaria. The term seems originally to have been a name given to any day or season of rejoicing. The Hilaria were, therefore, according to Maximus the Confessor, either private or public. Private celebrations might include the day a person was married or when a child was born, for example. Public celebrations were declared by the emperor. The Romans celebrated Hilaria on March 25th, the 7th day before the Helendas of April, in honor of Cybele, the mother of the gods. The day of its celebration was the first after the vernal equinox, or the first day of the year, which was longer than the night. The winter with its gloom had died, and the first day of a better season was spent in rejoicings. Valerius Maximus mentioned games in honor of the Mother of Gods. All kinds of games and amusements were allowed on this day. Masquerades were the most prominent among them, and everyone might, in his disguise, imitate whomever he liked, even magistrates.
Celestius, writing in the 4th century AD, described the basic multi-day structure of the festival as it related to the myth of Cybele and Attis. And at first, we ourselves, having fallen from heaven and living with the nymph, are in despondency, and abstain from corn. Actually, that really means grain, because corn did not reach Europe, as we have said in our popcorn podcast, until the 16th century. And all rich and unclean food, for both are hostile to the soul. Then comes the cutting of the tree and the fast, as though we also were cutting off the further process of generation. After that, the feeding on milk, as though we were being born again, after which come rejoicings and garlands, and, as it were, a return to the gods. According to the calendar in the chronography of 354, 10 days before the calends of April was the arbor intrat, or entering of the tree. According to Arnobius, in his Against the Pagans, Book 5, This involved cutting down a pine tree and setting it up in a place of honor inside the temple of Cybele. Fleeces of wool would be tied around the tree trunk, representing the goddess wrapping the dying Attis against the cold. The branches would be decked in wreaths of violets, as the mother adorned with early flowers the pine, which indicates and bears witness to the sad mishap. The priests would ritually mourn for the dead Attis, beating their chests and wailing. Following this, according to Anobius, worshippers would fast and, in particular, abstain from bread, in imitation of the time when the goddess abstained from Ceres' fruit in her vehement sorrow. And they would enter a state of mourning, wounding their arms and breasts.
This explanation of other types of spirituality is very interesting. The full festival can be tentatively reconstructed with the days of the festival translated as follows. March 15, the Ides of March, the reed entered. Its exact significance is somewhat uncertain, but it's believed that the reeds may refer to the riverbank where Attis was exposed as a child and rescued by Cybele. This begins a 9-day period of abstinence from bread, pomegranates, quinces, pork, and fish, as well as probably wine. Only milk was permitted as a drink. March 22nd, the tree entered, arbor and trot. A pine tree is felled. The tree is set up at the temple of Cybele, its trunk wrapped in wool and its branches decked with wreaths of violets. March 23rd is a day of mourning. March 24th is the most violent day of this period, known as the Day of Blood, or Sangus in Latin. Frenzied rites, including scourging and personal whipping, happened. Even castration rituals, heaven help us, would take place on this day. The tree is symbolically buried. March 25th, the Day of Joy, known as Hilaria, celebrating the resurrection of Attis. This was the Hilaria proper, as opposed to the mournful tone of the previous days. March 26th was a day of rest. March 27th, the final day, was known as the washing, lavato. That was added by the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. A brief word concerning calendars. Many changed political systems make a big point of changing the calendar. The Julian calendar was proposed in 46 BC by, and takes its name from, Julius Caesar, as a reform of the earlier Roman calendar, which was largely a luni-solar one. It took effect on January 1st, 45 BC, by Caesar's edict. Pope Gregory's calendar reform modified the Julian rule to reduce the average length of a calendar year from 365.25 days to 365.2425 days, thus correcting the Julian calendar's drift against the solar year. The Gregorian calendar gains just 0.1 of a day over 400 years. For any given event, for example, during the years from 1901 to 2099, its date, according to the Julian calendar, is 13 days behind its corresponding Gregorian date. For instance, the Julian calendar's January 1st falls on the Gregorian calendar's January 14th. Most Catholic countries, out of loyalty to the Pope, adopted the new calendar immediately. Protestant countries did so slowly in the course of the following 2 centuries or so. Most Orthodox countries retain the Julian calendar for religious purposes, but adopt the Gregorian as their civil calendar in the early part of the 20th century.
Some historians speculate that April Fool's Day dates back to 1582, when France switched from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, as called for by the Council of Trent in 1563. In the Julian calendar, as in the Hindu calendar, the new year began with the spring equinox around April 1st. People who were slow to get the news or failed to recognize that the start of the new year had moved to January 1st and continued to celebrate it during the last week of March through April 1st became the butt of jokes and hoaxes and were called April Fools. These pranks included hanging paper fish placed on their backs and being referred to as poisson d'avril, or April fish, said to symbolize a young, easily caught fish and a gullible person.
There are many interesting origin stories here. Another origin story dates to the mid-1600s, around the time Switzerland had signed the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, ending the religious wars. There were some factions that had immediately adopted the Gregorian calendar, while the cantons of Geneva and some others did not officially make the switch until 1701. A few cantons didn't make the switch until much later on throughout the 18th century. Those that had adopted the Gregorian calendar took to putting signs saying "Now Ren Troymen," or Fool's Dream, outside the homes of those who had not yet made the switch.
Now let's jump to the 18th century here. April Fool's Day spread through Britain during the 18th century in Scotland. The tradition became a 2-day event starting with hunting the gawk, in which people were sent on phony errands. Gawk is a word that means cuckoo bird, a symbol for a fool, and followed by Tally Day, which involves pranks played on people's derrieres, such as pinning fake tails or kick me signs on them. Sounds like a high school prank to me. At about the same time in Italy, a tradition of dressing as a magistrate and making false arrests developed. As the fake magistrate and the fake police were supposed to be taking the victim to jail, they would tell them they were Vecchio Pazzo di Capria, or old goat fools. Eventually, officials made this illegal in response to public reactions.
There have been some pretty notable pranks throughout the years. Some of these are rather amazing. For example, in 1582, when Pope Gregory introduced a Gregorian calendar, and people who didn't adopt it were often called April Fools.
A number of these pranks seem to take place in what is or would become the United Kingdom. For example, in 1698, a very clever Brit announced a special event at the Tower of London, inviting people to come and see the lions being washed. No such thing happened, but it drew very large crowds. I imagine watching a majestic animal like a lion being bathed is somewhat interesting.
Indeed. Let's go to the New World. In 1796, in Middletown, Connecticut, a handbill promised a marketplace for fools' coats. It said sellers should bring coats of various colors, yellow to predominate, with lots of tin bells and tassels. Sounds like a court jester. Yellow in some societies is seen as a source of wisdom. In other groups, a source of humor.
This next prank really surprised me, and it takes place in 1974. When residents of Sitka, Alaska awoke to see smoke rising from Mount Edgecombe, officials responded to a very serious possible volcanic eruption. But in reality, a group of bored people can be dangerous at times, had piled hundreds of tires and greasy rags in the crater of the volcano, no less, set them on fire, and then spray painted April Fool on the snow. Here's another military-oriented prank. In 1980, the magazine of the British Army reported that ceremonial guards' fur helmets needed trimming because the bear pelts were so thick the hair continued to grow. The prominent London Daily Express newspaper reprinted the prank story, perhaps because the article suggests that bear hormone could cause human hair to regrow. I don't know about you folks, but I'll take my chances with what the Almighty gave me.
Indeed. Coming back to the US of A, in 1983, an AP reporter asked Boston University history professor about the origins of April Fool's Day. Now, the professor jokingly cited a fictitious King Kugel. That's inspired by a noodle dish, by the way. He was shocked that the reporter ran the gag as fact. Continuing in the New World here, in 1984, Fritos placed a half-page ad in the Washington Post on April the 1st, announcing they were adding a raspberry-flavored Frito chip, which was to premiere at A&P groceries across the United States. Okay. In 1985, writer George Plimpton claimed that Sid Finch could pitch a baseball at over 168 miles per hour. Okay.
He could have made a career out of that. Here's another really weird prank. A British DJ in 2001 said a replica of the Titanic could be seen from the cliffs at Beachy Head in East Sussex. Regrettably, this prank had some serious consequences. Crowds flocked to view the made-up ship, and part of the fragile cliffs cracked and later on even crumbled from the weight of the crowds.
And there was no ship. Okay. You mentioned McDonald's. Let's mention Burger King. In 1998, Burger King put out a full-page ad in the USA Today declaring left-handed people could order a lefty Whopper with condiments rotated 180 degrees for a left-handed taste.
One has to wonder what that would taste like. In 2015, Continental announced they made special toilet paper for left-handed people. Somehow that information did not get into our toilet paper podcast, which I encourage all of our listeners to take a listen to.
Well, let's get the wheels rolling here and talk about Audi, the car manufacturer. In 2019, they announced the B-Tron vehicle, saying it runs on honey. The vehicle was to include an onboard toaster for morning treats.
Geez, you drive and cook breakfast at the same time. In keeping with our culinary explorations, also in 2019, our friends at McDonald's in Australia announced a wonderful new sandwich, a McPickle Burger, which was nothing but a large amalgamation of juicy pickles layered between buns with a slice of onion, ketchup, and specialty sauce. I'm a pickle addict, so I would probably make the trip just to try that.
Here's a few fun gags to pull on anyone who eats cereal for breakfast. Fill a bowl with cereal and milk and then place it in the freezer on the night before April 1st. Take it out and place it on the breakfast table to eat. Imagine the surprise of the person trying to eat that cereal, especially little kids.
What a mess.
Yes. Have you ever been surprised eating an Oreo cookie? Well, someone might have scraped out the cream filling and replaced it with perhaps mayo. That would surely give you a startling surprise. Now, I heard about a truck driver who relayed his fun prank on his boss. As drivers were returning from their trash pickups, they were standing around talking about different pranks that had been played at their various pickups. He decided to join in because his boss was eavesdropping. He said that a driver for a competitive company had run out of fuel for his truck, so he offered to let him borrow the company card for his company to top off his gas so he would be able to complete his rounds. The boss became so enraged, he came out red-faced and angry and asked him what he thought he was doing. Of course, this gave way to the fact that he had been eavesdropping. To calm the boss down, he said, "Hey, boss, don't you think that on April Fool's Day you might expect some pranks like this?" The boss was so relieved that he wasn't paying for the fuel for another company. All he could do was stand there and laugh as he tried to calm down. Here's another prank for you. There was this lady who had been working for a company for several years, and she was a very valued employee. When she and her boss were moved to a new office, the first day in the beautiful new office, she brought a small but lovely tree for their office space. She told her boss she would take full charge of the growing tree because he always killed any plants brought into the office. Sound like anyone we know? He was pleased with the arrangement. The lady gathered dead sticks and placed them in an appropriately similar planter. She filled it with rocks and dirt and even added a few dead leaves she had found. The beautiful plant she had promised to care for was placed in a closet out of sight. When her boss came in to work, she reminded him of their deal. This went on for about an hour. To her boss's relief, she pulled the plant out of the closet and said to him, "Don't you remember what today's date is?" "Well, today is April 1st. April Fool's on you."
Well, we hope that you have enjoyed this little dive into April Fool's Day. We hope also that you will join us again real soon. We have some other good things coming up and some more serious things, as well as a couple of other even more funny things. So for now, I guess that's it. Bye.
So long, folks.
Yes, and don't forget about the contest. Get those likes and subscriptions in so you can partake of the contest and win that lovely keychain. Have a nice day.